The Bulls of Edwards Elementary, by Stephen Lake. The Guardian Series Part 1. The school superintendent stood in front of Edwards Elementary, one of his local facilities, and paced back and forth impatiently as he waited for help to arrive. Today of all days this has to happen, he muttered to himself. Just then a loud, sonic boom tore across the skies above him, causing the ground and the windows to vibrate from its intensity. Looking up, the superintendent saw a man flying above him wearing a plain blue pair of tights, on the front of which was the Guardian Corps logo. The man circled the area several times before gently floating to the ground in front of the superintendent. "Hello, I'm Paul of the Guardians. We heard you've got a problem," he asked. The superintendent breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank God you're here." "I was worried," he said. Paul looked at the superintendent, and asked, "So what's the trouble this time?" The older man gestured to the school, and said, "Isn't it obvious?" Paul turned and studied the school with interest, and soon noticed that it was filled with a thick, inky blackness. What intrigued him the most was that it appeared as if it were liquid, and yet acted more like a wall of smoke. "Ah, a void cloud. When did this start?" he asked. "About an hour or so ago." Paul cocked an eyebrow at this. If that were true, this had to be the shortest time ever before being deployed on a job like this. Normally it took several hours before someone got around to asking Central to send someone out. And it wasn't that there was no actual emergency. Instead, it usually came down to a bad case of bureaucracy that ended up causing long delays between the start of an incident and Central getting someone deployed to the area to clean things up. That bothered him because, the sooner they were able to respond to these kind of issues, the better. "So what kind of creatures are we dealing with this time?" he asked. "Creatures? We haven't seen any creatures. Only that big blob of darkness you see over there," said the superintendent. Just then, a large, black, bull's face peeked out of the front door, glared at him, and then retreated back into the darkness. Paul's eyes narrowed. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me. Last month it was Rex's, and this month it's Bull's," he muttered. "Can you stop it?" asked the superintendent. Paul frowned incredulously. "Yeah, I got this. I just wish this whole blasted cross-dimensional war would end already. I'm really getting tired of these things." "There's been more," said the superintendent in surprise. Paul cocked an eyebrow at this. "Yeah, there has been. Why? Don't you read the news?" The superintendent shook his head. Paul rolled his eyes and muttered in disbelief at this. "I see our public schools are, as usual, in the capable hands of the intellectually deficient," he muttered to himself. He then cracked his knuckles, and said, "All right, back up. I'll see what I can do about this." The superintendent nodded, and then quickly ran away like a frightened child. Paul, seeing that the area was clear, began to build up energy in his body until it made the air around him crackle. He then threw his hands out in front of himself and fired two quick, powerful blasts of energy into the school. However, nothing happened. Not a bang, or a pop, or even a single noise. Under normal circumstances, that much energy would have removed the entire back half of the school and at least a good third of its roof. Apparently the void energy had swallowed up the two shots like gumdrops. He frowned at this. "Well, looks like we're gonna have to take this up a notch," he thought. He then floated up above the school and looked at the area behind it to be certain that the blasts hadn't actually gone through and caused damage on the other side. Thankfully, everything was fine. Both shots had been absorbed, and nothing had gotten through. At least the Corps wouldn't be charged with another case of wanton destruction. And it wasn't that he wouldn't fix any damage that he caused. It's just that, even if he did, someone would still file a complaint against him for it. He soon floated back to the ground, walked over to the wall of void energy, and put his hand through it. A sharp, burning sensation immediately engulfed his hand, causing him to draw it back quickly. Examining it briefly, he noticed that the void energy had reduced his hand to a shriveled-up mess. He drew it close to his face and studied it curiously. "Huh, that's new," he thought. Normally void energy completely erases your hand. This one just desiccates it. He then poured healing energy into his hand, fully restoring it back to its original condition, and then flexed it to be sure it was all right. Certain that everything was back to normal again, he returned his attention to the wall of void energy in front of him. Well, it looks like I won't be able to go inside the void this time either. So I guess I'll just have to try another approach to get at this thing, he thought. He then backed up several paces, and used his powers to create a rope in his hands. Next, he created a hook and fastened it to the end. After this he spun the hooked end several times before throwing it into the darkness. Within moments, the rope went limp. He wondered if this meant that the blackness had eaten both the rope and the hook too. Just then Paul felt the rope go violently tight, nearly yanking him head first into the blackness. He quickly put all of his energy into fighting the rope and holding onto it with all his might. However, only a moment later the rope snapped, causing Paul to fly backwards, nearly impacting a nearby car as he did. Realizing that the numerous cars and people in the area presented a problem, he ordered all of them to leave. They quickly obeyed. Soon, all that remained in the driveway was one vehicle. Realizing that it was abandoned, he lightly gestured to the car, causing it to float up into the air and travel nearly half a mile away before settling down gently on the ground. Satisfied with his work, he turned his attention back to the school. A moment later the rope, along with the still intact and attached hook, came flying out of the void cloud at him like a cannon shot, just barely missing his head as it did. This made him glare at the void cloud. Whoever was in there was playing dirty. He then summoned a much stronger rope, one made of a special composite material he knew was almost guaranteed never to break, along with another hook, which he then fastened to the rope, and threw it in. This time, however, he braced himself for a strong tug. He wasn't about to get caught off guard again. However, to his complete surprise, nothing happened. At least, not as fast as he'd expected it to. But a tug did eventually come, and he was ready for it this time. As soon as the line went taut he pulled on it with all his might, and almost immediately saw results. After a few moments of pulling, a massive, angry black bull appeared through the void cloud, the hook lodged firmly in its mouth, and struggled with all its might against Paul's powerful pull. Upon seeing him, it glared bitterly at him, but didn't let up its fight. Finally, fully free of the blackness, the bull suddenly gave up the struggle and began to walk obediently towards him. A few paces later it spit out the hook and studied him angrily. Paul grinned, tossed the rope aside, powered up, and then fired at the bull. But, to his disbelief, the shot merely glanced off the bull's forehead, and tumbled clumsily into the air for a short ways before disintegrating. He fired a second time and watched in dismay as the energy blast splattered harmlessly on the bull's face like a water balloon. Neither shot had hurt the bull, nor had they damaged so much as a single hair on its face. Paul cocked an eyebrow at this. "Well, that's disturbing," he said in dismay. The bull then huffed angrily at him, and pawed the ground, its hoof tearing up the concrete as though it were made of powdered chalk. Paul grinned slyly at this, and lowered himself into a ready position. If the bull wanted to be stupid, he was happy to oblige. "Okay, ugly, you want to play? Then bring it," he said, motioning tauntingly at the bull as though encouraging it to charge. And it did exactly that. However, to the bull's surprise, Paul wasn't so easily batted aside like it had hoped. As soon as the bull reached him, he put his hand in the center of the bull's forehead, and pushed downward with such force that he buried the bull into the concrete all the way up to the bottom of its ribcage, leaving nothing more than the back half of its body sticking out of the ground. But, as he did this, Paul felt his hand sizzle. Looking down curiously, he noticed that the palm of his hand had been badly burned. He quickly healed this, and then turned and studied his handiwork. As he did, he noticed the increasing amounts of damage building up in the area. He'd have to fix that before he left. No point getting written up again for not cleaning up after a job. He then carefully walked around the bull and studied it. Never before had he fired a shot at a bull like that, and not destroyed it. Most bulls were just as easy to kill as Rexes. And yet, this one was different. It was also considerably stronger than most of the others he'd encountered before. That both worried and intrigued him at the same time. He then grabbed the bull's leg, and flinched in pain as his hand began to shrivel up. He quickly pulled it back and studied the damage before glancing at the school. This was not normal void energy. Whatever was in the extra-dimensional blackness that filled the school, it gave the bulls an incredible power that could easily overcome someone like himself. Realizing the danger he was in, he quickly healed his hand, threw up a defensive shield around it, and then grabbed the bull's leg. But, to his dismay, the shield was consumed within moments, causing his hand to again shrivel up into nothing. He quickly let go of the bull, restored his hand, and then stepped back several paces. Just then he felt something emerging from the blackness behind him. It wasn't that he sensed a new presence so much as a rapid decrease of available energy. It was a feeling that was very similar to the void energy that filled the school behind him. He soon turned and saw another bull sticking its head out of the blackness as it studied him. It glared briefly at Paul and then retreated inside. It emerged a few moments later, running at full speed. Paul squatted down and prepared himself to do the same attack on the second bull as he had on the first. But the bull had anticipated this, and had raised its head to prevent this, which allowed it to nearly run over Paul as he tried vainly to grab onto the bull's body. Seeing that he couldn't, Paul immediately teleported himself to safety. As he reappeared, he noticed that both his hands, and part of his right arm, were badly singed and partially shriveled. He quickly healed them, and then studied the bulls from a distance. He watched in interest as the second bull began trying to rescue its compatriot, which was something Paul would not allow. He fired 2 powerful energy blasts at the ground under the second bull, blasting the surprised creature into the air like a bottle rocket. He then teleported himself above the creature as it was still flying upward and, with a powerful kick, drove it into the ground head first with a loud thud, burying it deep into the ground nearly up to its back legs. He then floated back to the ground and spit on the bull in disgust. However, when he did, the spittle hit the bull and sizzled. This caught Paul's attention. He quickly summoned a small blob of water in his hand, and tossed it at the bull. The water immediately ate through the bull's body like a knife through warm butter. Paul's eyebrow rose slightly at this as a sly, gleeful grin grew across his face. "So you can kill these things," he said with dark, gleeful satisfaction. He then called down a rainstorm of biblical proportions on top of the bulls, and watched as they rapidly dissolved away until nothing remained of them. He then called up a large ball of water, and sent it careening through the front door of the school and out the sides. Within moments, several bulls came blasting through the doors on either side of the building, screaming in agony as they did, and vanished into the water, never to be seen again. A few moments later, the blackness inside the school subsided, quickly returning everything back to normal. Paul then set about cleaning up the damage his battle had caused. Once everything was properly in order, he called the school staff, and told them it was now safe to return. As he began to walk away, he looked back briefly at Edwards Elementary, and then shook his head. A guardian's life is never boring, he thought. After a few steps he paused, and looked back again. Something about this battle just didn't sit right with him. Why were they so susceptible to water? That's odd, to say the least. I've never seen anything like that before. Then again, that whole hand shriveling thing was new to me too. I guess I'll have to check in with my superiors on that, he thought. He then leapt into the air, and flew off into the distance. As he vanished over the horizon, a Rex appeared from behind a nearby tree, and shook its head. "Boss ain't gonna be happy about this," it muttered.